You all remember this story. I think it was 1996. The CEO of Malden Mills kept 3,000 employees on the payroll for a quarter after the factory burned down, and it became a national story. Whether this was a good or a bad decision is, in fact, debatable, because the cost of keeping the factory open, actually of rebuilding the factory, ultimately put Malden Mills into bankruptcy. What is not debatable is the fact that this was such an unusual decision that it put him on the cover of Time magazine and in the presidential box at the State of the Union. Aaron Feuerstein, the CEO of Malden Mills, a devout Orthodox Jew, explained that he drew on Jewish tradition when faced with a crisis. When all is moral chaos, this is a time for you to be a mensch, he said. So some of the research we do at the Business and Society program goes deep into business education, and one of the things we find is that if you test the attitudes of MBA students, they expect that they're going to face conflicts when they go back into the workplace, and they believe that they're not being very well prepared to do so, whether these be the kinds of trade-offs that we've been talking about this morning versus return versus externalities, environment, communities, fellow employees. Similar sentiments are expressed by business people. And so we are fortunate this afternoon to start off a panel which we've entitled Beliefs in Business, Do You Leave Your Values at the Door or Not? The question is, do values actually belong in the workplace, or does market morality trump? And we're pleased that we have representation this afternoon from business education sector, religion, as well as the business sector. So I would like to turn it over to Pim to introduce our moderator.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You know, let's. I want to take this time to just really introduce the moderator of your first panel this afternoon, my colleague here at Bloomberg News anchor, Margaret Brennan. Margaret is the host of In Business. It's the Bloomberg television show that airs from 10 a.m. until 12 noon each day. Margaret is a Whitehead Fellow with the Foreign Policy Association, also serves on the advisory board of the Smurfit School of Business at the University College Dublin, and also the junior board of the Central Park Conservancy. And I didn't know this, but Margaret, how do you say mensch in Arabic? The reason I ask that is because I know
the translation on that one.
the Habibi, maybe Habibi, who knows? But as a Fulbright Hayes scholar, Margaret studied Arabic at Yarmouk University in Irbid in Jordan. So she has some understanding of the concept of belief in a society. And shukran for being here. And I turn it over to you, Margaret Brennan.
Thank you so much, Pam. And thank you all for joining us for what we hope to be a very lively and interesting conversation. I'm Margaret Brennan. As Pam said, I host a show called In Business here on Bloomberg from 10 to 12 every day. And I'm excited at the lineup of panelists that we have. And before we introduce them, I do want to say, these days more often than not, when we are talking about global finance and the global markets, which is what we do in my 2 hours of TV every day, we tend to visit this nation's capital quite often. Washington having more and more of a presence on Wall Street these days. A lot of the language that we hear being used to describe the business community and the political community includes a lot of characterizations, a lot of beliefs, a lot of values being claimed to be American, un-American, capitalist, not capitalist. So there's really a broad array of topics that we can bring to light here on this panel. I want to introduce to you some of the panelists. You do all have their bios, but just briefly, this is Carolyn Woo of the University of Notre Dame. That's where she holds the deanship of the Mendoza College of Business. Before that, she was at Purdue University. Her research that she's done personally focuses on strategy, entrepreneurship, and corporate citizenship. Next to Carolyn, we have Bill George. He currently is a professor of management practice at Harvard Business School. Before that, he was the chairman and CEO of Medtronic, where he led that company to grow its market cap from $1 billion to $60 billion during his leadership there. And then we have the very Reverend Dr. James Kowalski rounding out our panel here. He served for 9 years as rector of one of the largest Episcopal parishes here in the U.S., and he's elected as the 9th dean of the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine here in Manhattan. So we do have many aspects here of this conversation, but I want to start off with something that I thought was absolutely tailor-made for this panel, and it's a story that we did on my show today, linking quite directly questions of beliefs and business. The CEO of Barclays, John Varley, this is one of the biggest banks in the world, second biggest in Britain, said in remarks just last week in a church in the UK that profits are not satanic. He got up and gave a speech basically defending the business community, defending his line of work in banking, saying talent is highly mobile. If we fail to pay or are constrained from paying competitive rates, then talent will move to another employer. Profits are not satanic. By extension, pay is not something to be viewed as shameful, and invoked religious beliefs to defend his own personal line of work here. So, should we have the CEO of a publicly traded institution, a massive bank like Barclays, channeling Gordon Gekko in a place of worship? What are your thoughts, Reverend?
Wow. Channeling Gordon Gekko. Okay. I'm not going to go there. I'm not surprised that he feels demonized. I'm not surprised that he invokes Satan, whatever he does or doesn't believe about Satan, and we're not going to go there either. I don't know that that'd be very helpful. I think people are scurrying around trying to figure out what happened and who's to blame, and I don't think, frankly, even profits are to blame. Compensation isn't the problem. I get paid. I can't go on record saying the cathedral makes a profit. We're a not-for-profit organization. We could lose our charitable status, but we try to run surpluses and plow them back into mission. I'm not sure that that's different from what any enterprise wants to do if it believes in its mission and feels it has a purpose worthy of those efforts and sustainability. I think the real issue is people don't know what happened, and they don't understand why people kept being compensated for something that seemed not only to have no sustainable value, but in fact didn't track to anything that had any basic underwriting principles or any investment theory that even the average person on so-called Main Street could understand. And when that happens, and you realize that people who are at part of the heart and soul of what makes every community work from a business standpoint were somehow seemingly involved in this, you have not just a scandal, but you have some underlying conclusions that the system is no longer trustworthy for the average guy. And does that make people want to believe in the devil or not believe in God or believe in God more? Or I don't know. I think we've got to really get back to some of the very basic understandings of what makes a community work and how we sustain our life together.
Bill, I want to ask you, because that idea that financial services, which did end up becoming a large part of the growth story in the U.S., some would say an oversized part of that story, that somehow, because it's not a tangible product, a tangible industry, that it's somehow less pure. That if you're creating Coke, Pepsi, a car, a product to be sold, that is something tangible you're contributing to a society. Can you apply that to profits? I mean, what profits are more pure? What profits are more valuable to the shareholders, if not society at large?
I'm not going to get into the pureness of the financial system, but I will say that I think financial structure, I am on the board of Goldman Sachs, full disclosure, that lost sight of its underlying purpose.
Which is?
It's to serve society by providing the financial capability for business and a capitalistic system to work. And the fuel for that is profits. Without profits, there will be no expansion in a capitalistic society. You can have government funding like we have now, but you will have no growth. My company, Medtronic, was benefited by financial people who funded our company early on when our founder founded the company. We've gone from 2 employees to 38,000. That would not have been possible without appropriate funding. So I don't think that's the issue. And profits are what makes that system go. It's like the fuel in your tank. The car, you have a beautiful car, but without any fuel in the tank, it simply will not go. I think a lot of people lost sight of that's what they're called to do, is to create a viable financial system. And you cannot be successful in business over the long term if you sell into a sick system. This is what the healthcare companies are learning. If the system itself is flawed and sick, and where I would fault the financial leaders is not working to create a viable system and taking it to extremes. I think we're dealing with symptoms of the problem here and talking about profits and compensation. I think they are important, but the root cause of this problem is not credit default swaps. It's not subprime mortgages. These are just symbols. It'll be something else tomorrow. The root cause of this problem is leaders. Leaders who lost sight of their calling and practice short-termism. That's the root cause of the problem. And we need new leadership. You all can create all the rules, regulations you want, and smart people will find a way to get around them if they don't sense what is our role here. And the great leaders of our financial system throughout history have understood that's our role. And we have a very viable role. It's very different than the role of government. And I think we need to get back to that now and not think about what went wrong in the past. We're fighting the last war. We need to structure the capital markets of the future, which is, I think, the purpose of this conference, is to think about what should they look like going forward, not what did we do wrong in the past. How are we going to structure a viable system that works for every person, not just for a few people on Wall Street?
Well, it did certainly work for certain shareholders, depending on what time period you're talking about.
Depends on whether you dump the shares.
Record profits, exactly, but record profits at Goldman Sachs or the like.
Yeah.
Or if you talk about the spillover effect, we talk about quite often here in Bloomberg with the waiters, the waitresses, the restaurants that did benefit. They did take profits. Those were real profits to them as a result of oversized bonuses that were paid out. So there was a reward in a tangible sense at that time. Now that we've seen the virtual collapse of the financial system, it seems more clear that there was something perhaps wrong in the value system of business at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But what is the rule of thumb then? If it's not to rule a company to reward the shareholders, who are you ruling it for? Your board of directors, which then brings you back to the same question?
If you run a company, and a lot of you disagree with this, if you run a company strictly for the benefit of the shareholders, you will eventually destroy it. We've seen that happen in General Motors. We've seen it happen in company after company. The world's largest bank has just gone through that and now is in hock to the U.S. government for $351 billion. Okay? The only way to have a successful enterprise, remember John Whitehead wrote the principles of Goldman Sachs, you have to serve your clients. And if you lose sight of that, a company, an organization, whether you have a service or a profit or a product, can only be successful insofar as it creates value for its customers that it's greater value than its competitors do. And if you fail to create that kind of value, in the end, you can't sustain yourself. You can have the short-term profits, but you'll destruct. That's what happened with Lehman Brothers. In the end, you can't sustain the enterprise. And I think we have leaders that don't understand that they're in it for the short term instead of recognizing it's got to be a long-term proposition. That's the only way that they can be viable for the long term. How would I feel if I were head of a firm that had been around for 135 years and went under? Look, I didn't create the firm. I didn't create the company. I was standing on the shoulders of people who had built it for 30, 40 years. And now in these financial firms, some of very large firms have gone under, and I think it's a tragedy.
Carolyn, in your role at University of Notre Dame and in trying to create some teachable lessons, some takeaways from this, you're forced to have some context or to try to put these things in context. How do you do that when we aren't quite sure what the beliefs are? We're not even quite sure what capitalism looks like in this century now. How do you teach what the basic tenets of those are and then infuse values into it within the framework of a university with Catholic roots?
How we teach it, first of all, we have to disabuse two assumptions. One assumption is that people do not know right from wrong. That is just not true. All research shows that when people's neck is not on the line, they know what is right and what is wrong. The second assumption, which is you could laugh at that, is that people don't care about what is right and wrong. And that is not totally true either. There's a lot of research that shows that if you ask people what are the 5 most important values to them, truth-telling, honesty, and integrity tends always to be one of the top 5 across all segments of cultures. And so people do know right from wrong. They do care. But what we have discovered is that knowing does not lead to doing. So the education challenge is to how we engage our students, not to tell them right from wrong, but why is it when our neck is on the line, we in some ways bleach our ethical sense, we walk away, we rationalize. And rationalizing is very important because we are thinking beings. We are always rationalizing. We cannot stop rationalizing. The key is, do we rationalize so that the outcome is a good one versus an outcome which is completely self-centered? So education really is about getting to the students, first of all, to have a sense of self-awareness, to let them know that they can't say, I really am a good person, but I was under pressure. The first thing they need to know is that they have to accept responsibilities. When you say, should people leave their values at the door? Well, the decision to leave the values is a value unto itself. It's a priority. It tells you what you care about most. So the first thing is really a self-awareness that leads to ownership of those choices. The second thing then is, a lot of students would say, I do not want to do things which are bad for society. They have a sense of what is the right thing to do. Then the question is, what do you need to do to close the gaps? What are the things that stand in your way? There are issues of moral courage. There's an issue of, I don't want to pay the price for this. And that's where also is a conversation. You ask your students, for what do you not have to pay? Do you not pay for Starbucks? Look at what you have around you, your laptop, your backpack, everything. You pay something for everything. Why would you not pay something for who you are and what you believe to be right? And so here is really about inspiration, to get them to rethink about who they are and what they have to do to honor that. And then there's this whole issue of moral imagination, to be able to imagine a different outcome rather than to feel that they don't have any choices. And so those are what we do. It's not an ethics lesson on right and wrong. It's not to preach at people about what they should care about, but it's to understand at that critical moment when knowing has to lead to doing.
Can I just pick up on that?
Sure.
I think I really like your comment about knowing who you are. My whole class at Harvard Business School is built on that concept because I think, and you have to prepare in advance. These days, things are moving so fast, you can't just figure it out when you get into the crisis. It is the test. It is the ultimate test. But you need to prepare in advance. You need to be grounded. You need to have your external reference points. You need to know who you are and have people around you and your support team that keep you straight, keep you and can tell you when you're going off. And I think this is the role we all have. And I think back to the crisis, the financial crisis, a lot of leaders didn't know who they are. They thought they were all about impressing others with money, fame, power, and glory.
So how do you do that when these individuals graduate from the MBA school and become some of the bodies on Wall Street, elsewhere in the industrial world? What are those morality checks? Because are they earnings conference calls? Are they talking to your investors? Because often you can't express things, or there are constraints that prevent you from speaking in black and white terms. There's a lot of gray. There's a lot of, while required disclosure, not very transparent disclosure out there. So where does that come down to the question of personal judgment?
It comes down to your support team. You have people that help keep you straight in your life, and I think we need to build that internally and particularly
But Dick
externally.
Gold or Lloyd Blankfein to say in absolute terms, not only did we make a mistake here, but we did things we shouldn't have. We sold things to people we shouldn't have. We sliced and we diced them in ways that were just, in some ways, exploitative of the individuals. They would never say that. No publicly traded CEO would say that and hold his job, or he'd see his share price move as he made those comments on the earnings conference call.
Well, I can tell you in this case, the case, the first person you mentioned, refused to listen to advisors. I've known many people that tried to advise him that they were going wrong and they were in trouble, and he refused to listen to both the internal and the external advice. Like in the case of Lloyd, I know for a fact that he was listening to everyone, to members of his management team, members of his board, and outside people very carefully. And he really did that, and I think that's one of the reasons one of the firms is doing very well. It's not coincidence that it's really a difference, comes down to a difference in leadership and how leaderships look at their role. But you don't know. You can have 30 successful years and you can blow it in 30 minutes because you weren't ready to handle that situation when it came to you. And the problem is you don't get that 30 minutes back.
Except there's a part of this conversation that reminds me an awful lot of every other conversation I've ever been a part of when people are trying to figure out how do you learn what your compass is and how you stay true to your compass. I guess most often, as I was emerging in my own career, I was listening to parents talk about parenting. And I'm wondering, how did we get that conversation about how you learn and actually act on values so disconnected from the workplace? Didn't we know our kids were eventually going to go to work? Well, sometimes we wonder, are our kids ever going to go to work? But we hope our kids are going to go to work. And did we think when they went to work, there wasn't going to be this continued on-the-job training, ongoing rehearsals for maybe the crisis? But I don't know about you, most of these crises don't just all of a sudden in my life show up out of nowhere.
Right.
They're cumulative. Some are more spectacular than others. But some of the small ones can get you just like some of the big ones in terms of teaching you patterns of losing your bearings.
Yes.
Giving you permission to rationalize in the truly clinical sense, which is to make up a narrative in your mind that is more and more out of touch with reality. Does this sound familiar in terms of reading the newspaper? How did these people not know, or who wasn't telling them? The truth is, when you interview them, or when I have a drink with some of the people I know who were part of the teams, they'll tell me very candidly they did know. They did know. They knew that these things were not guaranteed. What is a guaranteed mortgage? That's a mortgage that nobody should be writing. How do you guarantee a mortgage? These are terms that we were using that at their face make no sense. Now we invent a new term called these are toxic assets, like this just dropped out of the sky. Come on. People knew they were doing this. I heard a very high-ranking person say they were writing so much of this in London, if we didn't write some, we wouldn't end up with any of the derivatives. Now, if somebody were eating a plate full of poisoned food, I hope you would think morally your first obligation was to try to stop them from eating it. If you failed, would you then consume some of it so they didn't eat it all? I mean, this is an ethical discourse that's beyond anything I've ever been a part of.
But those individuals were being rewarded in the marketplace.
They were getting commissions that bore no relationship to anything.
The benchmarks for everyone else.
Right.
So the broader question is where you are checking that value system, because it seemed to be in the share price, or it seemed to be in your earnings results. It didn't matter how you got those profits, and that was also the case in the post-Enron era.
But if you're in a system where it says it doesn't matter how you're getting your profits, at what point do you have to say, that sounds a lot like a kind of greed? Now, I don't want to get into Satan and I don't want to get into the 7 deadly sins, but in some sense, greed is perhaps the most social and political of all. Now, if you read the newspapers, you'd think lust is. But, I mean, that sells more newspapers, I guess. But greed is actually, in terms of social political impact, historically, far more powerful than anything else. Even murder tends to be a little bit more focused. I'm not talking about war. But greed, when people start saying this is what everybody's doing and it's all about profits, you know there's something not right about this system, it seems to me. And so now again, you could continue to do it and make a lot of money, but to say that you had no idea that this was not in alignment with your own moral compass, I find that hard to believe, because I do believe people are fundamentally good and they fundamentally know right from wrong. And I knew a lot of people who now would say they knew they were doing things that were wrong.
Which leads back here to Carolyn, because can you actually teach ethics then? If they fundamentally know that it's inherently within themselves, what is there to teach?
Well, it's the challenge of letting people know that knowing does not automatically translate to doing, and that there is a huge agency issue of putting yourself responsible. I want to go back. You say, when do we have the moral checks? I want to say a few things first, and that is cheating is very, very frequent in our society. There are studies of cheating in schools, starting in high schools. There's 75% self-disclosure of cheating. There's cheating in journalism, there's cheating in sports, there's cheating everywhere. So as a society, there's actually a lot of cheating behavior starting at a young age. And there's the question, who let the line slip? You know, before we even get into the boardroom, I think that is a societal question. How did we let the line slip, and why is this so much cheating? Going to the next thing is that when people cheated, they will often tell you there are about 4 reasons why they cheated. Number 1 is a noble end. You know, they're keeping jobs, they are helping shareholders, they are so there's the noble end. They don't want to disappoint parents and shareholders. The second one is that they would tell you that there's no harm done. You know, no harm to anyone. And the third thing really is they're often not caught. And so you have to understand the reasons of cheating. On the other hand, when you go back to people and say, do you have a version of the type of person you want to be? You talk about self-checking. It's not just your board who checks you, which, by the way, we've never talked about board of directors' role in picking the right CEO and what type of checks they go through. But you talk about self-checking. There is a point where we know the person we want to be. And when we work with our students, we ask them, where do you get your sense of who you should be? Inevitably, it comes from 2 sources. One is from their religion, whatever religion they belong to. But the second thing is from the people who love them. They will always say, I get a sense of who I am because I don't want to disappoint my grandmother, who would never think I could, stoop to that level. So I want to come back to this. There are sort of external checks. We have seen that organization climate does make a difference. There are companies where the control systems and the values are serious and they work. And they regulate behavior in that way, that there is a culture. Because a lot of times people think that there are no penalties. This is tolerated. Well, there are things we could do to show that that is not true. But it does not eliminate the need for self-regulation, which goes back to the fact that with cheating as endemic as it is, how do we hold the line? Where do we start? And education has a big part in that.
Bill, you're at Harvard now, and listening to Carolyn speak here, she's coming from a business school with roots in the Catholic Church. Notre Dame's a Catholic institution. You're at a secular institution with roots in the much lauded Protestant work ethic, right? What's different? Is she talking about religion at this point?
Well, I think it's not about religion. It's clearly about values and what's the source of your values. We talk about that in my classroom all the time. Who do you turn to?
Societal then? Are you divorcing religion
Not at
from
all.
that judgment?
But it's up to each individual. To whom does one turn when you're facing great pressure? We talked about it in the classroom this week with somebody who was going bankrupt in his firm, and he was a person of faith. He turned it over to God. That made some people uncomfortable. It made others comfortable. So I asked the question, who would you turn to? Who do you look to? What is the source of those things? I think it's really important that we talk about these things openly so we know what is our basis, what is our grounding. Do we have a grounding within us and knowing who we are? I actually tell students, Carolyn, that they shouldn't be too dependent on their family. They have to go beyond that. That may be a source, but they have to go beyond that. But I think we have to learn how do we stay grounded? How do we stay, and what I talk about in one of my books, how do we stay in touch with our true north, which is our set of beliefs, principles, and values? We have to know what those are first, and then we have to stay true to them. Most people do know what they are, by the way. They can all write them down. They know the difference between right and wrong, but they go off. And how do you stay on course? And I think that's the real question. A lot of people have gone off, and I do think it's a question of short-term gain versus long-term growth and sustainability for the individual as well as for the firm. And some companies appear to be successful because in our society, we're a society of instant gratification and instant measurement. This myth that's been existing here for 25 years, that the stock price represents a true value of a firm, which Justin Fox did a nice job of exploding, has been a myth all along. And a lot of people bought into these myths, and they made a lot of money doing it. And these are myths. And we need to move away from that and say, how do we create true value in our own lives? And where does that come from in your life? And how do we create in our firm? And I think the real test of any leader is, can you align the individual's values in your firm, your own values, the individual, and the firm's values? And if you do that, you can almost be assured of having a successful firm.
Mervyn, can you help us define some of those values here? I want to refer back to that story I told you about earlier. It's a great one. But the comment that I read to you earlier from Barclays' CEO was not the only statement made by the CEO of a financial firm in Britain in a place of worship. Goldman Sachs' international advisor, Brian Griffiths, also said at St. Paul's Cathedral, publicly, he made a statement saying, quote unquote, the injunction of Jesus to love others as ourselves is an endorsement of self-interest. What do you make of that?
Is the Church of England out of control, or I don't. That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
Well, maybe this is as simple as proof texting. I don't know. I mean, I think you have to care about yourself to care about others. So, we can go into the wild blue yonder about that, but I don't quite know what his point is. I think...
Well, maybe this helps. The rest of the sentence read, we have to tolerate inequality as a way to achieving greater prosperity and opportunity for all.
Well, again, I think if all we're going to do is pick and choose certain assertions, quotes, and I'm not saying you're doing this, Margaret, but these people making these speeches to then footnote what it is they want to assert or the conclusion they want to draw. There's nothing new about any of that. I think the fundamental question is, as Bill is suggesting, and I think also Carolyn, if you don't look beyond yourself as well as also within yourself, and over the course, I think, of a lifetime, try to figure out what your values are that you believe are maybe going to change to some extent because things change, but there are some of them that are basically what anchor you. They ground you. That you would have to say, or others hopefully would say to you if it happened, you dislodge from them and you will lose yourself. And that can happen in all kinds of ways, through addiction or just by power or whatever. So, as I was suggesting before, people somehow were thinking they were being taught values, but somehow didn't think that was applicable to the workplace. That's a huge disconnect that I don't buy. My work, what's the word for work? It's not just meant to be religious. Vocation, vocare, that which is called out of you, that I get to express in the real world, in the body politic, who I am by virtue of how I do my work. That's what your work, your vocation, is supposed to mean to you. But here's a total non sequitur, perhaps. If you read, in my opinion, in the New Yorker, October 26th edition, Jane Mayer's extraordinary article about the Predator War, in it you will hear about how we can disconnect from war while we are making war. We can fly over things and have valueless wars or victimless wars. This is the person who is conducting the flight can be so disconnected. So what I'm suggesting, and she said the robotics of war, quoting people like Peter Singer and others, I find the robotics of our community life, the robotics of financial technologies, have allowed us, if we decide to do this, to helicopter over this enterprise called the commonweal as though we're not part of it. And so I meet increasing numbers of younger people, meaning nobody any disrespect, who are trying to get as much as they can, as fast as they can, so they can get out of what? This going to work. Because they're not going to work because it's a vocation. They're going to work to make enough money so they can do what? Then spend the rest of their life doing what they really want to do. Well, my wife is a physician. If she talked like that, I would suggest to you that you find another doctor. And yet I've met colleagues of hers who talk like that. If we're helicoptering over this enterprise, trying to figure out how we navigate and we get out, and so we take our commission, we take our profit. Compensation isn't the problem, but we have to figure out, for example, how do you compensate people with some view of the long-term consequence? Because you say, because there's no concept of ownership. You've got people who are taking our money and doing things with it, but they have no, what is the word, skin in the game. I mean, isn't that what that whole predator war thing is about? You could be waging war, whether we should be or not is a whole other issue, but you could be doing it in a way that you're totally disconnected from any sense of what the consequences are. And in that article, she raised a fascinating point. What if in Gaza there had been no reports available? What Israel is held to an accountability. And I think this is a good thing as much as I support Israel. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But they're held to a kind of accountability, for example, in Gaza, that we are not, as the United States, I'm speaking as an American, are not being held to in Pakistan. And now look at what's going on in the financial communities. People are flying over this thing and making wacky decisions and then getting bailed out or continuing to get bonuses. I don't understand how we can think this is to the betterment of a commonwealth.
Well, to talk about some of that collateral damage in the financial world sense of things, you look at the unemployment numbers, right? Well, we're looking at unemployment ticking higher to 10%, probably within the next few months. Get the unemployment figures on Friday. When you look at the job cuts that have happened, it seems a huge human toll. But does that justify bailing out, spending billions of taxpayer money simply to save jobs? The example you would choose here would be the auto sector, something that wasn't systematically important to the survival of this financial system more broadly on a global scale. Is doing that justifiable on a belief basis in a way that's maybe not as long-term for the financial health of this country justifiable? Bill, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I think the jobs crisis is the crisis. It's a little bit like we've gone through Hurricane Katrina and everyone looks around and said, oh, the sun's out, hurricane's gone. And no one looks at the devastation. All the people are wiped out of their homes. You know, that's what's happened to us today. By the way, the jobs number in the United States today, pre-Friday, is 25 million people out of work. That's 16.8% of the people who cannot find full-time employment. So let's get the number. And among young people, that number's in the 30s and 40s. Among ethnic groups, it's extremely high. This is a huge crisis. Now, I am not in agreement with the notion of saving jobs. When a job is not viable, and Judy started with Aaron Feurenstein, he was not a clear-thinking person. Saving a job that's not viable does not save anything. We need to create jobs that are sustainable. And by the way, it's the private sector that's going to create the sustainable jobs that pay taxes more than what people receive in income. And I think we need to get back to creating jobs. 70% of all jobs have been created by small business in the last 25 years. New company startups, the great job creators of the last 25 years, hardly existed 25 years ago. They had less than a dozen people. Walmart, Target, Google, Intel, Microsoft, and you're right down the line. And I think we need to get back to that. But we need a financial system that will fund these people. And so we need a capital markets that work. We had no choice. I can tell you, stop looking at Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson as people trying to bail out individual companies. No, they were trying to save the system. Now, you get back to your very tough question about General Motors. No, I don't think Chrysler should have been saved. I don't think it's worth saving. I actually do think General Motors was worth saving, but it had to have a change in leadership. The leadership was flawed for 50 years. I grew up in Michigan. I've watched the leadership closely. Today's leaders have a very different attitude. Will they make it? I don't know, but I would certainly bet on them that it would any of the prior leaders that led to this crisis for General Motors. Look at Ford. Ford's doing very well, thank you, because it has some visionary leadership that knew what it had to do. So I think the taxpayers will probably, in the end, come out okay of General Motors. Some of the others, I don't know. But I think, in the end, we had no choice but to save the system. So we weren't saving companies.
Carolyn, can I ask you, how do you teach someone in an MBA program to lay someone off?
By the way, before I go into that question, I want to add another thing is, we often think about the government bailing out those companies. However way you think about the bailout, it's really not bailing out the people who started the fire. It's really trying to protect some degree of financial security of the people who are affected by it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to say sometimes people speak with so much anger, but it's really a fire was started, and we could argue, but there are people whose houses will be burned down. So I think it's really trying to, Bill used the word save the system. I would say save the large number of Americans whose pensions and life insurance and so on are all on the line because of that. I think the whole question about layoff, in fact, my son asked me, neither of them is in business, but they say, how would you ever lay someone off? And that seems like the cruelest things to do. I have about 3 or 4 responses. One is the whole idea of creative destruction, that if we do things right, there would be innovation. And innovation does displace. So we don't have people at switchboards anymore plugging phone wires. We don't have people who are driving carriages. And if we don't have these type of creative destruction, we would never proceed. So number one is that if we do everything right, it would lead to certain skills no longer needed, certain jobs no longer needed. That needs to happen. The second thing then is, how do we prepare people for that type of destruction? So that as we lay them off, what are the type of programs that allow them to be retrained and give them some type of a softer landing place for a certain period of time, not forever, to get them going again. The third thing, which is also very necessary, is that it's not whom you lay off, it's what type of new opportunities have we created for people. Right. So going forward, I hope people don't go back necessarily into the old jobs that they lost, but if we're really good at green tech, if we're really good in medical devices and so on, we would be creating new opportunities for people. So those are the 3 things. It's not just a layoff as an end unto itself, but to have other opportunities and also to prepare people and help them through that transition.
I think I agree completely. I think you're right on the money. Are we creating more jobs and we're cutting back? There are changes that made, and I think one of the things I'd rather see, for instance, instead of saving jobs, how they put the money into retraining programs. If you're in a factory, a lot of those jobs, no offense to people in North Carolina, but T-shirts are not coming back to North Carolina. So people that are only trying to make T-shirts in North Carolina need to go through retraining mid-career. Not all your education can occur before you're 30. We need to help people go through these programs. I actually think that it's actually humane to lay people off in certain circumstances. Medtronic went from 4,000 to 38,000 employees. But there were layoffs during that period of time because it made us more competitive and enabled us to create jobs for others. And so the overall trajectory was upward, but you had to take some cutbacks. I've also laid people off who weren't performing. And it was hard for them to say to someone, I actually think you'll be happier somewhere else. The company's getting larger. I think you'd be happier with a smaller company. So actually sometimes, and people got angry at me at the time, they come back 2 years later and say, wow, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I got a fresh start. So this is not the end of the world. What the end of the world is, if we're not creating anything. Like right now, no one's creating. And that's why we need a financial and banking system will support the creation of jobs, not just pull back.
Bill, in those situations where you have had to lay people off, how much do you take into consideration your own beliefs, your own values, your own sort of personal interaction with them? I mean, can you do that without it being too painful, or do you have to take a step back and just look at the balance sheet, look at the figures and say, we need 10% gone? I mean, how do you do that and reconcile it with your own beliefs when you know that person is a single mom and desperately needs a job, or they're not going to get another one nearly as good as this? How do you execute that?
Well, I think it's very consistent with my own personal beliefs. These things will happen. I think we need to help people get relocated. We set up a lot of programs inside the company, job fairs and other things to help people get relocated to other jobs. And you maybe that single mom loses their job, but if you don't make that move, there may be 10 more over here that also lose their job because the company becomes less competitive. Now,
do you look at that before you lay them off?
You bet. Absolutely, we look at that. And you think about it in the values context. How does it fit with the values of Medtronic? How does it fit with the values of this organization? That's extremely important. But I used to get a bad reputation when I was there of not allowing people to hire, because I used to say, if you're going to hire this person, you're prepared to have them for the rest of their life. Because, we do have pension programs, we do have post-retirement health care. Are you prepared to have them? Because let's go conservative on hiring. Maybe you outsource those jobs. Maybe you hire outside support rather than hiring permanent employees, which that's the contract with them. So I think more conservatism on the build-up. But I'm talking philosophically about business. But I do think, yes, if it's not consistent with your values, if I do one thing, I say to everyone, these are the values of Medtronic, okay? And then I turn around and do some at variance with that. I am now going to destroy the fabric of the company. I don't even have a right to do that as a leader,
Mm-hmm. Reverend, how many times or what's the experience like if have people come to you for advice on whether or not to take a job when they look at the values or perceived values of that corporation? There have been a fair amount of corporations whose reputations have been dragged through the mud, a fair amount that have been beaten up in the headlines. But a job's a job these days, and they're desperately needed. If someone came to you and said, I inherently disagree with this corporation's policy and how their health care benefits or their policies towards women or something like that, what would you do? How would you counsel them?
Well, I think that's a very dangerous path to go down. If you say, look, a job's a job. I'm desperate, and so I'm going to make what I already know is a desperate decision. It's not one that I feel good about. It's not one that I would like to live with for a long time. It's the best I can do right now. All that sounds like it makes sense, except in real time, it's a nightmare. And then if it lasts any length of time, you get an itemized bill, not just as the employee, but also the employer. So just as when somebody gets laid off, I would wonder if the employer what kind of quality of communication had there been during the entire relationship, not just the layoff. What kind of communication is there at the layoff? What kind of severance is provided? Those are also arenas of value negotiations for the employer. I would say to an employee, if you aren't asking questions about who you are and whether or not you fit in this place, how are you going to show up in the morning expecting to bring value to that company? And if you don't show up in the morning to go to work bringing value to the company, how is that company going to survive? Where is this whole system going anyway? And I think that those are sometimes questions people just haven't thought through. And now, again, they may have an urgent need. Do urgent financial needs as a single mom appear overnight? I mean, well, you can say, well, yeah, something cataclysmic happened, or usually there is an unfolding of a whole series of other decisions that we would try to support, making better decisions and creating some life options so that vocation, work, becomes one of the several places where life becomes fulfilling. Everybody wins by that. Mm-hmm. And then you'll hear from the employer how different their relationship is to that employee, and if they have a lot, let's say, send me 10 or 15 people like that. And I actually was helping to run a program to prevent teen pregnancy many years ago in Hartford, Connecticut. And when we were successful, when people really believed they had something to lose by getting pregnant, young women, they found ways not to get pregnant. What that really meant simply was if they believed that there was opportunity out there, they approached their life choices in entire. Well, is this rocket science? I mean, I remember as a teenager, I thought that way. It wasn't just family values or something like that. It was my own sense that I have something to contribute, and if I get off track, I'm not going to be able to make the contribution I could make. If I take a job that isn't right for me, I'm already getting myself off track. And you'd say, well, I didn't have any choice. Now I'm living a life where I feel like I don't have choices. Well, this gets harder and harder to get up in the morning for, doesn't it?
And what I hear from my students is not I'm going to go against my values, but how do I know what the values of this organization I'm going into?
Yes.
And then I'll get a call 6 months or a year later, and they'll say, I was just told by my supervisor to go back and redo these numbers because we can't sell our investors unless I change these numbers to look more attractive. And I know these are the right numbers. So how do I deal with that? So you get into these gray area things that is not quite so black and white. And then they get at variance. And you can't just flee every time that happens. Do you stay and play? Do you try to change the system within? Do you leave eventually? Do you leave right now? And I've talked to so many people going through those dilemmas. Are very much real world. And sometimes they like the financial support and they're trying to pay off debts too. But yet they have to walk away and say, look, it comes down to my integrity. I'm going to have to leave.
We do want to open this up to questions, but I want to let Carolyn respond. So once you think of those questions, I want to ask you, so do you screen the corporations that come to recruit at Notre Dame? Do you look through their value system before you allow them to recruit on campus?
We do not check each value system, but if any company has some breaches that we know of, we tell them that, whether it's an executive education client or whether it's a recruiter, that it does not work with us.
On what basis?
That
when you have a breach, what kind of breach? What do you mean?
And you see things such as people who reneged on offers that were given to students. And so that is the most obvious breach that we know of. We don't go into various type of legal documents and what are the cases which are pending in court. Not so much those, but more the breaches, the ethical and legal breaches that we are aware of.
Okay. Are there questions on the floor? You want to go ahead?
Thank you. I'm Courtney King. I'm from the Committee Encouraging Corporate Philanthropy. And I just, on this topic of beliefs in business, you leave your values at the door. We're talking a lot here about the scarcity of jobs, which is a big issue. And there's also another issue, which is that a lot of employees now, there's been great studies recently that they're looking for more than just a paycheck at their job, and that they are evaluating the values of the company and what the company is doing to benefit society in deciding whether or not it's a place that they want to spend their career. So how do companies need to adjust to those changing expectations?
Companies are actually doing a lot, particularly the ones which are really eager for talent. So earlier we had PwC talking. When they're competing for talent, they become very aware of what young people nowadays respond to. So there are different programs that, for example, allow for unlimited number of volunteer hours for causes and foundations that the company supports. There are sabbaticals. Some companies now are doing corporate citizenship reports. So actually they go to another level of accountability and transparency to do that. So companies are actually doing a lot. Many of them are moving into this whole area of the sustainability indices, where they respond to a whole set of questions of how they would be responsible to the environment. The UN Global Compact has 5,000 signatories, and they agree to abide by principles of human rights, labor rights, sustainability, and anti-corruption, and they're required to put a report out there. So there's actually a lot in that area that's happening.
I'm a great believer in corporate philanthropy. I think Milton Friedman was absolutely wrong when he said that's not the province of corporations. I think we have an obligation. But let me go back beyond that, because I don't think that's enough. I like your use of calling on the word vocari, Jim, because it really is vocation. And if I used to say to people, you know, if the mission of Medtronic doesn't turn you on about restoring beautiful life and health, then fine, go to work somewhere else. You know, if you can't get in sync with the idea of working for a financial enterprise that's really trying to help provide the capital resources people need to expand their business or to help them enhance their own wealth, then, you know, shouldn't go to work there. So I think every employee needs to be in touch with the work. And when you see it disconnected, like it was at General Motors, not that we're making beautiful cars, but we're disconnected, that disconnect can destroy an enterprise. So I think it's got to be in the work. And yes, every employee I encourage all employees to do some form of community service and engage with the company in its own philanthropy, either through service with those organizations or actually giving in parallel.
I want to follow up. You mentioned corporate philanthropy here. Bill, with Goldman Sachs, there's much talked about sort of cultural imperative or moral requirement for Goldman Sachs to make a fairly sizable donation, philanthropic enterprise to sort of make up for some wrongdoing the past year. It's been discussed quite openly. Pete Peterson of Blackstone was here at Bloomberg and said that donation needs to be at least $1 billion to make a difference. What does that do? Can you make right? Is there a requirement to make right?
Well,
Who do you
first
make
of
that
all,
judgment?
having been close to it, I don't know of the wrong that's being made right. And honestly, I don't. And I don't believe in reparations. Goldman just put $200 million more into its foundation. Mm-hmm. It's looking at doing a lot of additional things. It's one of the most generous companies in the world. And the other boards in which I've served, Exxon, Novartis, Target, are all extremely generous donors to the community. And I think that's great. But I don't think any of those companies see it in terms of reparations. Mm-hmm. Certainly Exxon does not.
And I think, again, that we miss an opportunity if we just think this is really about a new iteration of robber barons, and we have to see if we can make them philanthropists, if that's even the right word at the end of the day. I think it's really, if you watch the ball here, it's about people wanting to belong to something bigger than themselves. And one danger may be that one of the great areas of entrepreneurship is where individuals, kind of in their own homes, through their own internet savvy, can create enormous opportunities and have their own business, but be in some other ways very disconnected. So I think the real opportunity here is to create a sense of belonging, which is the only remedy I know to that sense of disconnect.
Right.
And what is it that we belong to? You know, the great story about the rabbi who comes into a land dispute, the two neighbors on the perimeter fighting, nearly killing each other, and they call him in and say, "You resolve this for us." And in front of them, he suddenly drops to the ground, puts his ear on the dirt. For a long time, they wait, and he stands up and he says, "The ground has spoken. You belong to it." What do we belong to? And what are we a part of? Or are we just on our own? Are we here just to, take it, winner take all, play the game? Thanks for playing. You're the winner.
And I also want to say something, and that is, a lot of these questions come from a premise. It's sort of like business is a necessary evil. Mm-hmm. We need to rethink. Business is a necessary good. Without business, we can't solve any of the problems. Look at where we are now. And because it has so much potential, it has a potential for good or bad, but we need to think about, we need to check that tone when people come to us, where business is presented as a necessary evil. And, nowadays I go about and try to go on the line and say business is a necessary good. Let us not ever forget it. And when there are times when we not lift up to that, we'll fix our own houses. Mm-hmm. But that is the premise.
Ma'am, you've got the microphone there.
Thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation. My name is Aline Felder. I'm a business consultant. And one of the areas that we're sort of touching on in terms of leaving your values at the door or not is the whole aspect of corporate culture. And it's very difficult once you get into a company and then you see something, it's massaging numbers or whatever the case may be, and then you don't know what to do, and you get the message, well, that's how things are done here, or you have to keep your mouth shut if you want to get that promotion, et cetera, et cetera. What are you advising your students in terms of speaking up and doing the right thing and facing that difficult decision? Because I think of the anecdote that came out of Enron that when I think it was Jeffrey Skilling was at Harvard Business School in a course on ethics, or the way he answered a particular question is exactly the way he ran the company, looking at the shareholder value only and with no regard to what the real numbers are. How do you work with your students to confront those challenges of corporate culture and doing the right thing when they're faced with that?
Let me take that. There are two paths. The first one is if you suspect that something is not right, there is a way of investigating it. What students a lot of times do is that when they clam up or they get angry, and sometimes they're like a bull in the china shop, sometimes they also have hurt feelings and they make accusatory type of remarks. The first thing is, we talked about earlier on Mary Gentile Aspen Institute's work on giving voice to values. When you really care, you suspect something is wrong, there is a whole sort of set of skills and thinking of how do you want to engage this particular issue. It does require training. That's actually an area where very few people have training. But I tell you my second path. I never use other words. I don't swear or anything like this, but so this would come off a little bit strange. When I was a student, someone told me, and that is, you have to have your go-to-hell money. And that is, when it's time to tell someone to go to hell, that you have your money. You can't just say it without any backing. So I always tell my students, I expect them to have enough savings after 5 years of work for 1 year of expenses. Later on, in 10 years, if you have a family, it may take you 10 years to save 1 year of expenses. So those are the two things. And I want to focus on that. The way to have a backbone is to have some capability. And so this whole thing about thrift, someone mentioned that earlier on, is absolutely necessary to have savings in order to get to that point when you need to walk away.
Where's the microphone?
Never sell your soul to the man.
No, but you have to go to hell money.
Well, I tell them the same thing.
All right, we'll give the microphone to you next. Here, would you go ahead, sir?
Yeah, I want to raise a question. You talked about, previous speakers talked about externalities and taking care of that. And just now we had a little discussion on philanthropy. I just want you to reconcile those two, because if firms are not accounting for the externalities that they incur, where's the place for philanthropy?
The question is, what's the role of the microphone was turned on about halfway through your question, sir.
My question essentially is, firms are not paying for the externalities that they incur right now. And so there's a big debate, cap and trade, should it be there, should it not, etc. Yet there are billions of dollars being put into philanthropy. Shouldn't there be a priority about first paying your way for what you incur and then talk about philanthropy?
Well, philanthropy cannot be an excuse for harm done. If Medtronic makes bad products, we shouldn't wait to have people sue us. We should go into the home of the person, which was a policy, and talk about what we can do to make restitution. How can we ameliorate the situation? Philanthropy cannot be a substitute that. There was a well-known executive in the Minneapolis community who ran a very, very large company who backdated his stock option to make $500 million. And in advance of being caught at that, he was giving a lot of money to charity. So everyone said he's wonderful. I don't think it's so wonderful, that he gives $27 million here or $10 million here. I think one has to look at one's actions of the firm for which you're responsible, and his own in this case. And so, I think we have to be responsible citizens. If you're in the healthcare field, you need to help create a responsible healthcare system, which we don't have today. That's no different in the financial field, the energy field, take any education field, any field that you're in. You need to work towards a responsible system that works for everyone. And if you don't, in the end, your firm will suffer.
Ma'am?
Much has been written about whether MBAs have failed or business schools have failed. And I'll jump on the bandwagon a little bit in the context of this conversation with two questions. Why is leadership and values a course at Harvard or at many other business schools rather than being taught in accounting, in marketing, in competitive strategy, meaning as part of the core curriculum, no matter what aspect of management an MBA is learning about? And second, where is the room for the true servant leaders as heroes for MBAs? Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, versus a Ken Lay or a Ken Griffin or a CEO.
Well, I'll speak to that. I'll let Carolyn do it. That's reason I went to Harvard Business School, is to teach exactly the course you're talking about, leadership and corporate accountability. Call it leadership and values. Call it whatever you like. That was the purpose. I think we found over time that there was a great rationalization on our faculty that we're teaching values in all these courses. And in point of fact, we weren't. We were teaching financial instruments. We're creating clever ways of lean manufacturing. We weren't really teaching. And so we needed to address explicitly with cases of bad situations and good situations. So we actually do teach Martin Luther King. Now, in my course, which is kind of more the personal side of leadership that we've created, it's very much aimed at what would you do in this situation, not what do you think Martin Luther King did or what Ken Lay did. We have too much analysis of others and not enough, and we have too many students going into consulting, analysis, sitting behind a computer, and not actually getting out on the firing line. And I think every person, all these people are going to be called on to be leaders. And the best time to learn how to lead is when? It's today. It's now. It's not 5 or 10 years from now. And I think people need to put themselves on the line and be tested. Not so they can break the bank if the guy Kevel at Societe Generale did, but have that opportunity, that challenge. But yes, I think we need role models as servant leaders, but then you have to decide for yourself, what do you want to do? You can't preach that. You can't say, oh, let's all be like that. I think you have to decide back at who are you and what's important to you in your life and your career. And you're thinking about how do those two integrate into your not just your vocation, but your whole life.
I just want to say I think there's a place for these specialized courses on leadership. If you listen to Bill, there's a lot of self-reflection, which is necessary, a lot of talking through. When you mentioned about the other courses, in the end, it is not about teaching leadership per se. I would say where business schools have not done a good job is the failure of inspiring our students to think about the bigger purpose of business, to not think about business in sort of like mechanical terms, and to think about competition like a winner take all, and this is a game and we position things here and there, and to think about the good that business can do. And it's really that inspiration sometimes which has been missing. Yeah. And if that inspiration is there, it's not just in finance or accounting, it's a way of how people look at the career path that they choose, and they could then identify with a vocation. And that is entering into a profession where you can do so much good and bring so many solutions to it, leveraging resources that you would otherwise not have. That's where I think we have not done a good job. The big questions, the worthy dreams, they have not been laid. And if they happen, then it would cut across sort of the daily life of our students.
I already told you my wife is a physician, and you probably guessed I went to seminary. So I've gone to more medical kinds of things, including reunions and medical school whatevers, than I ever wanted to. And I still go to some seminary things more than I want to. And the same questions are asked in those settings about those students, those people who become professionals and get disconnected. They don't emerge as having the kind of leadership skills or leadership and values. They don't really show the integrity, and they haven't integrated what we thought we were teaching them. And certainly, I'm not going to list all the various scandals clergy have been involved in with misconduct and malfeasance, but we've been no strangers to this. So it isn't just what happened in the school or didn't happen in the school. What happens in lifelong learning and a commitment to say, I'm probably going to burn out on occasion, or I'm going to get more than frustrated, or I'm going to lose my way. And so what I've been hearing are a variety of ways that we individually or we have observed in others, people have tried to reconnect to some things that help them stay the course and really become the kind of person, leader, community-spirited, valued-based leader that I know I had the privilege many years ago to be part of the inaugural class of the Henry Crown Fellowship, and that was a wonderful opportunity for me to go into a so-called secular environment where there were more sophisticated conversations about leadership, values, and community than I found when I went to those seminary things that I was just dissing. And why is that? Well, because there were some people who are really taking the issue of community, leadership, values seriously. And if we don't do that over a lifetime, if we say, as Bill Gates did for a while, didn't he? He said, I'll get to philanthropy once I retire and have the time. And his friends said, Bill, it doesn't work like that. And look at what's happened since. And was he a robber baron who became a philanthropist? I'll leave that for you to debate. And there is a legitimate debate about that, I suppose. But he has become, with Melinda, a force for enormous good. And also, I think, created, arguably, wouldn't you say, a great company. You know, these things were not disconnected. And he's still, I think it's fair to say, a relatively young guy. Has maybe decades left to go to keep the music playing, to keep the fire burning, you know, and to pass the torch.
We have time for one more question. In the back.
Hi. Doing this right? Can you hear me? What I find, what I learned a long time ago when I started my career at Lehman Brothers, when I was looking for a purpose, was really that contribution is the key to happiness. And I miss it. And Reverend, I'm so glad to see you saying that, because I adore you. You don't even know how much you've taught me. But let's take Goldman Sachs. I'm going to walk away from here. I think it's wonderful what you said about business is good. I so believe that. I volunteer in pediatrics at a major cancer hospital, and we need the money. But you know what? Hugs help. And what I'm saying is, and what Goldman doesn't get, is that people are crying for authenticity. And when you go and say, I'm going to put $1 billion in a fund, and you're chasing money, it's not coming, it's not authentic. I can go and take a paycheck and make $100 million and put $1 million in the pot. And so what does that really mean? So I think that those are the things, when you're talking about teaching the students early on, is to really teach the MBA students the joy of contribution. And I know that when I'm there, when people come from some of the firms, and I know what the difference is, and it starts at the leaders, the people that come with their children, and they're bearing gifts, and they're little handmade things from their children, and it's all that they have, but just the joy of contribution. Then you've got other companies where they're just writing the checks and they're miserable. So I think those are the messages that I'd love to get across to Wall Street.
Well said.
Okay. Did you want to respond to that at all? The idea that the size of the contribution perhaps has less of an impact than the intention behind it?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a great believer in authenticity. My first book was by that title. That's in my courses. I think that's what it's all about. And I think that's what Carolyn says, knowing who you are. That's what we're talking about, knowing the authentic person. And I think Jim has given us a wonderful way to think about that. We can only become and sustain that in community. If we separate ourselves, we are not people living in caves. We do it through the kind of things you're talking about. That was wonderful. And that's where we really get connected. If we get too high and mighty and our feet never touch the ground, or we're flying around in private planes, we lose touch with what's really going on. That's why service becomes so important. And I think corporations should serve. I think each of us should serve individually in our communities and build those connections. Bob Putnam wrote a book a number of years ago called Bowling Alone. If we move as a society to just working off computers and BlackBerries and behind computer screens and lose connection. Look, having 1,000 friends on your Facebook account is not like having a discussion that we could have for 15 minutes.
All right. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. And thank you for your participation.
Jim, Bill, Carolyn, and especially Margaret, fabulous. Thank you so much.